Church Planting and Renewal Conversations. I'm Chris Vogel, Director of Next Gen Pastors, and I serve M&A as the Director of Ecosystem Development. If I were to ask, are you energized or weary? Do you find leadership easier after this past year or more of a challenge? My gut tells me it would be the latter. Maybe that today's title resonated with you when you saw the sign-up. In talking with church leaders over this past year, I have found that there is not just the longing for tactical knowledge as how to move forward. There is a privation of leadership skills to navigate the political, cultural, and spiritual minefields in the church today. There is a weariness, a deeper sense of desperation from a variety of positions on many issues that makes leadership increasingly complex. To move forward, we may need to recalibrate how we lead and how we think about leading. With us today are two gentlemen who have given great thought and effort to helping leaders succeed. George Schenk is a ruling elder at Chesterfield Presbyterian Church in Chesterfield, Missouri, just outside of St. Louis. While presently retired, George spent most of his career training and developing managers and leaders in a variety of different corporate settings. Tom Gibbs is a teaching elder, having served RUF at Baylor, and since 2002, he planted and pastored Redeemer Presbyterian Church in San Antonio, Texas. He's stepping down from that role to assume the duties of president of Covenant Theological Seminary as of July 1st. Well, before we jump in, let me start off by saying this is meant to be a conversation. We invite you to ask questions. Open up the chat box, the Q&A feature on Zoom. Now, if you're watching us from Facebook, it's going to be a little hard to track any questions that are there, but we'll do our best. So please throw us some questions. We're so glad you're with us. Well, welcome, Tom and George. Let's just start off maybe in some ways stating the obvious, but maybe giving some specificity to it. What has been the toll on church leadership in this past year? How have pastors, how have sessions had to navigate some tough waters? Anyone may jump in.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that introduction. I mean, I think pastors everywhere and ministry leaders everywhere are experiencing this past year, COVID and the political environment, on top of what was already becoming a challenging ministry setting. And so it has just been a tough year, and challenges both external, but also personal as we've navigated a year of challenge. There's been a withering effect, I think, on what pastors and their families are experiencing.
You know, my observation is probably a little bit more limited than Tom's and Chris's, because my involvement is mainly with one church. But in watching what's happened at our church over the past year and a half or so, I would say I see two things. One is kind of a sense of isolation that comes more from COVID than from anything else, I think. A missing of face-to-face contact and touch that takes its toll on people. And that is a great creator of anxiety, even if you may not feel it on the surface all the time. My observation has been it's operating beneath the surface, and people are more reactive in both positive and negative ways because of that. So I've definitely seen that. I've also seen it in our church. I've seen, you know, that old saying that necessity is the mother of innovation. I've seen that happen in our church. And I've seen us do a lot of new things in the past year that I think people feel proud of and that have worked well, other alternate ways of meeting. And so I think we've learned and grown in the middle of this challenge. A lot of that has been, I think, because we've had some good leadership from the very top of our church to help us do that. But I think that those things will benefit us going forward too. So there's both a kind of a dark side and a bright side that I've observed in our church.
But I have a poll I want to launch in a minute for all the attendees. But Tom, you had mentioned some of the challenges, both external and pastoral. That's going to be in the poll. Just explain that briefly, and then I'll launch the poll.
So I think, just to highlight what George just said, I do think there has been an encouraging bright side to the leadership challenge of the past year, because it has forced congregations to be innovative and creative. But we haven't just been dealing with COVID. We've been dealing with a political landscape that was stressed by COVID, and then we've had a number of issues be given, I think, rightly greater prominence in our conversation about race and social justice, and how that intersects with the church and biblical authority. And then these are mapped on top of the already accelerating disengagement of millennials and Generation Z. And so I would just say those are three external challenges that pastors have been dealing with in churches. So the political climate, the polarization within the church regarding COVID and the response, and then the disengagement of millennials and Gen Z, maybe being accelerated by the current situation. And then pastorally, the internal challenges, what pastors are experiencing, along with just everybody in the church. We're obviously experiencing isolation, a sense of disconnection. I think pastors are also experiencing decision fatigue. There's a sense in which maybe pastors in sessions are feeling like, we're supposed to have the answers, and we've made a lot of decisions, but it seems like there's no decision that doesn't have a downside or a negative side, or doesn't, we just can't satisfy everyone. That joined with a diminishing lack of trust, a lack of connection. I think pastors are feeling increasingly siloed in their relationships within the church. Like, who can I talk to? And maybe I can't talk to you in the way that I used to talk to you. And then now all of those things cascade into the life of the pastor, where bringing those problems home, there may be lack of sleep, there may be change in eating habits, there may be a lack of exercise, marital stress. So there's a whole range of self-care issues that emerge as these stresses mount. So those are sort of internal and external challenges.
Yeah. I launched the poll. We'll keep that up for a minute. And those of you attending, let us know of those, which kind of hits you the most in the external challenges, and in your pastoral experience, or what you're experiencing, perhaps yourself, whether you're a pastor or not. And go ahead and start. You can click in on those. Let us know where things are at for you and your experience. Well, as that's being we walk through that. What's the fallout that you're seeing from all of this? What might we expect to see as we keep moving forward with regard to leadership and those issues?
Yeah, George, I'll just jump in. I think all of us are experiencing people leaving and coming. It's been fascinating how I think the common experience for pastors is some of our congregation have felt that we have not, acted faithfully, and so have departed. But then another group have come because it felt more aligned with their preferences, and I find that that's a common story across the church landscape. Mm-hmm. And that those kinds of transitions are always challenging for pastors. But that's just one that comes up to mind specifically. George, did you want to add something?
I'd say there's kind of a loneliness and isolation that I think a lot of people are feeling in our church. Although we've been able to overcome some of that through being innovative about how we meet outdoors, for example. We have drive-up meetings where people come in and park their cars and are connected on via AM radio the sermon's broadcast via AM radio while people are out parking in their cars, and they can at least see each other through windows. And, that's helped a lot. But at the same time, it's not the same as sitting across from someone and looking them straight in the eye without a mask on and reaching out and touching each other one way or the other. And you lose intimacy, I think. We can carry on transactions, and we've been fairly good about that, but intimacy is lost. And I think most of us long for intimacy, whether we realize it or not. And so we need to find more. We're looking forward to finding more ways to reconnect as COVID-19 restrictions are loosened up.
Absolutely.
Well, the results from the poll, one under the external challenges of the greatest struggle, 45% said it was the polarization regarding how to respond to COVID.
Yeah.
Close second to that is the political climate. And when it comes to the pastoral experience, two of them are fairly close. The decision fatigue certainly is one of them, the lack of connection, then followed behind, a little further is isolation. The physical care issues, that only 5%, maybe because that COVID hasn't affected that. Some of us haven't been doing well with physical care for years, so who knows? So that kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of where our attendees are at in all of this. So
that's right.
Have a question right here already from Sam Brown, who asked, how direct should we be with folks coming into our church who seem to be running from the previous church over COVID or political issues? So how much should we seek them to be reconciled? And that is part of it. As a pastor, we're always happy to have new people. We're sad to see others go. And we sometimes, rightfully so, go after the sheep that wander, and we are very quick to enfold the sheep that come in. How would you counsel a session? How should they respond? Because there seems to be a kind of a shifting going on, Tom, as you had mentioned. People are leaving, people are coming. The net gain and loss, we may end up finding ourselves about the same place, but what's going on behind all of that may well be the problem too.
So the primary question then, Chris, was how direct should you be in addressing those things?
Yes.
Okay. I have my own opinion and an observation about how that's being done currently in our church.
Okay.
I think you need to be direct, but you need to be direct about the right things. Okay. And to me, the way not to be direct is to talk directly about political issues and engage in an argument about the pros and cons of positions on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. I do not see that, at least on a corporate level, as being something that you can do productively. I think what you can be direct about is the dynamics of polarization, and the dark side of polarization, which is focusing on differences rather than commonalities. And, what commonalities do we hold with those around us? And, my feeling has always been there are two basic ones that we hold with people around us. One is there's the brotherhood of fallen image bearers. Okay. Every person we meet is one of those. Okay. And that's a lot to have in common with someone. And then, you have the brotherhood of Christ, brotherhood and sisterhood of Christ. And that's important too. And, even within the church, there can be polarizations, around differences in political alliances and differences in things like style of worship service or whatever. And so what we need to be direct about is not what the right style of worship is or what the right political party is, but what's the right way to interact with each other around our differences, and what does the Bible teach us about that way of being with each other when we're having difficult conversations or differences. To me, that's the big thing that stands out.
Yeah. I agree with what you're saying, George. That's really on point. And I would just add that COVID and the response within our churches has just elevated the overall anxiety of what people are experiencing. And so as people are in these transitions, they are in a more reactive place. And they're kind of wanting to lower the anxiety for themselves. And I think it's highlighting something that we're experiencing across the church, and that is that the key to us sort of resolving where we fit in society or in church is when everything kind of lines up to where I want it to be. And historically in the PCA, people have chosen our churches a lot of times because we align theologically with what people are preferring. But now there's a much greater focus in terms of the conversation on culture and how we engage culture. And this is a new category that's being given a lot more prominence, and it's shaping how people are experiencing the church. And so you may find that you agree theologically with your church, and yet the way they're engaging culturally is dissonant or is frustrating. And so now this is a new difference that you haven't anticipated. And so what do you do? And I think one of the challenges of what we need to do with folks who are coming into our churches, not only having this more sort of upstream conversation about the gospel and our common unity in Christ, and celebrate those issues, we also need to have the conversation not so much about the specifics of what position you should have, but to introduce the conversation of what is the Christian's responsibility in the world. Like, we need to have that conversation in our churches about how we engage culture and what does that look like, and to begin to help people who come into our church have that conversation earlier than later. This is one of those things that people are evaluating our churches on. How are you going to engage the outside world? How are you going to engage culture? And I think that's important. And again, I think and we should be helping our people also understand that the expectation is not that, we're going to check all the boxes and then you're going to feel safe until you find the one box that you don't check, that we don't check for you. And so navigating differences is one of the, I would say that's one of the big issues that's come out of COVID is we aren't doing such a great job of that. And we see that congregationally, but we're also seeing that at our local governance level in our sessions, because I think this is what pastors are experiencing and ruling elders is wow, we thought we were all in agreement and we had this camaraderie and team, and now we're fractured. And so what can we learn from that? What's the opportunity coming out of that? I think that's a very important question.
That's very helpful. We may well have taken some classes and thought about aspects of culture, but that is not usually in the forefront. And it may not even be necessarily in our stated church's philosophy of ministry and what have you. So what do those leadership opportunities look like for sessions as they move forward? How do they kind of work through all of that?
Yeah.
Other than, agreeing that this is the culture view we're going to take, which isn't going to happen.
Yeah. I think this is a question that has just been really highlighted by COVID. Just on the issue of masks, what are we going to do with masks? So churches are doing so many different things, but I think it's important to recognize that sessions are always dealing with issues that potentially are going to be are going to surface difference. And so this is an agility that sessions have to learn to navigate. How do we navigate difference among ourselves and within the congregation? And essentially, that's a conversation about the politics of ministry. And I think, I don't say this tongue in cheek, but I think sometimes we think as Presbyterians, because we've got a very clear polity, that's going to make the politics easier. But I'm not sure that's the case. And in fact, some research suggests that because we do empower so many stakeholders in our system, it might make the conflict more challenging in some of our settings. So I just think that it's important for our pastors and sessions to understand, people have interests, they're stakeholders. There's people who agree and then disagree. There's people in between, and pastors have to learn how to navigate the political landscape of their local session. I'll just stop and see if George wants to comment. I can make some more comments.
What I've seen happening in our church lately is that we're communicating with each other more often than we did before. Okay, so for example, the last couple of months, our practice has been meeting as a session once a month. Okay, this month we'll meet as a session 4 times this week. Okay, and there's also smaller discussion groups that are taking place between the session, the elders and the deacons, and then the elders and the deacons and various ministry leaders in the church, non-staff ministry leaders and staff ministry leaders. So the number of meetings that we've deliberately created and engineered are increasing. Okay, and whenever we can, we look at an opportunity to do that face to face, whether it's outdoors around a picnic table that we did a couple of nights ago as a session meeting with deacons, or whether it's in somebody's garage with heaters turned on if the weather's cold outside, or other places, is that we're deliberately trying to meet more frequently to talk about both challenges and the opportunities that are presented as we reconnect, as things open up. And so that's been a very deliberate focus. Okay, and I know it's been hard work. We were at a meeting a couple of days ago where our pastor said, "I'm tired. I've been working hard," but at the same time, you could tell he was energized because we're doing these meetings, and he's getting a chance to talk with more people. Other people are getting a chance to talk with each other more frequently. And so it's both a burden and a pleasure, to do this hard work of reconnecting. And I think my personal feeling is it's made a difference so far, and it will continue to make a difference in the future. And you got to be creative and deliberate about turning up the volume a little bit on those meetings and creative ways to have discussions about both challenges and opportunities for growth.
Mm-hmm. And that sounds great. I'm going to just give a little pushback and just say, and I'm sure you're not saying, it's not meetings for meeting's sake, because there's a point in which we grow weary of talking.
Sure.
So what's kind of foundational to those increased meetings that are making them effective? If that question makes sense.
It's being very specific about challenges and opportunities,
okay,
in ways that people can see that impact what they're currently doing and what they're interested in.
So you're actually talking about issues.
Yes, very specific issues, programs, how to expand programs, how to reach new people that we haven't reached before, mm-hmm. how to reconnect with each other. What does that look like to really reconnect? So these are working sessions. They're not just sitting around and talking kind of sessions. And so I think that's been a real key.
Now, I would assume there's a level of trust that goes on with that.
Yeah, the more you talk to each other, it's actually, even people for years, you may not have seen them. Like there's some people in the church that I've known for 20 years, but I've seen them maybe once in the past year. And somehow the basic level of trust is still abstractly there in your head. But I haven't seen you for a while. I don't know what's going on with you. So I think these, just seeing people and talking about real issues and seeing people getting excited about new ideas or how to handle a challenge and building off of each other's ideas to create new ideas. I mean, that's been invigorating for us.
Yeah, Tom, you wanted to say something?
So, well, and I think what George is describing is a very healthy leadership system where people have already decided that we want to enter into a dialogue about resolving challenges and seeing challenges and how they can become opportunities. And one of the things that I think is assumed in the kind of scenario George is envisioning is that we don't know what the solution is. We haven't figured it out. We're going to allow that to emerge. Okay, so that is reflective of a healthy leadership approach to navigating difference. So I would commend that. I would say that many of our pastors don't have the luxury of that kind of conversation and dialogue being sort of the standard. But instead, I think what a lot of our ministry leaders are experiencing is they come to a meeting and the answers have already been decided in a sense. And now we are here to leverage those arguments to reach that goal. And so it introduces a much more oppositional and adversarial dynamic in the session meeting and in the meeting, which that becomes really hard for the pastor because most pastors, I think, are wanting to be mediators, right? They're wanting to bring people together. And how do you end up navigating that kind of conflictual dynamic that emerges, whether we do mask or no mask and whether we do one service this way, one service that way. And you end up where there's no win-win scenario. There's scenarios and there's loss. So I think it can be a real important strategy for elders to step back from the tension of that decision, what are we going to do, to let's have a different conversation about how are we going to have these kinds of conversations where there are differences. What is going to be our strategy and approach to dealing with those kinds of things, and to think more constructively about how do we have a healthy conversation about difference.
So what does that look like as we're engaging that? Some of the phrases and terms I know that have been used is aspects of having a non-anxious presence, of self-differentiation. Those may or may not be terms familiar to everyone listening. How does that, maybe if you could define those terms and how might that play into this conversation? Help us think through this.
Well, the concept of differentiation arises from systems theorists, counselors. It actually is a concept that comes out of cellular biology, and it's essentially the idea of I know who I am, and I know who you are, and that's not mixed up. And so differentiation in an organizational setting is the awareness of a ministry leader or a person in any social organization to define oneself, know what they're about, to be a responsible person in relation to other selves, other people, and not take on their anxiety or their issues or their frustrations, and not feel like I have a responsibility to manage or solve those things. And inevitably, a less differentiated person is going to either run away from that anxiety and stress or over-function and take too much responsibility to resolve it. And our stress as a leader is going to increase in proportion to how differentiated we are in an anxious system, if you will. And maybe we can bring up that little diagram we talked about.
Sure. Pull that up. Talk us through this diagram, Tom.
So I think, the call of the leader is to be responsive and not reactive. And actually, I'm looking at this now, Chris. Can we do the other version?
Sure.
I think
that one.
Yeah, that's a lot better.
It's a lot clearer.
So that's the action above the line is responsive action, which would be healthy and we would say aligns with a differentiated stance. Below the line would be unhealthy and where we're taking on the anxiety of the system and we're tending to be reactive. But we can be responsive in a more directive way, active way, and then also through a less directive or more being way, presence. And sometimes we don't have to have the answer. We just need to be present, right? We just need to be with somebody. And so the responsive differentiated action is going to be sort of functioning in these various quadrants. But I think that where a lot of us are experiencing in our churches is below the line, if you will. And there's a lot of distancing behavior going on where trust is breaking down. People are absent, triangulating. There's a lot of fear and insecurity. And then there's also a lot of controlling behaviors going on. Angry, micromanaging, manipulating, gossiping, destructive conflict, if that makes sense. And I think that where we have to focus is how do we flip, how do we flip the line? How do we get our behavior and our sessions to be more above the line than below the line?
Good. And I'll be sending out one or both of these charts to you because that, if I understand, that's the Ethos Leadership Initiative, which is coming out of Redeemer in San Antonio, correct?
Yeah.
This is something you put together. Oh, great. Well, very helpful. Mm-hmm. Yeah, George, any thoughts with that from your experience in the setting you've been in?
I would totally agree with what Tom just said, and what I think one of the primary responsibilities of leadership is to create a healthy system. Okay. And I don't think many times leaders think about that as a primary responsibility. I'm supposed to put in place programs, get attendance up in the church, make sure we're doing a good job of teaching our young people in the church about the basics of the gospel. All of those things are important, critical. But we miss the boat when we neglect to look at the health of the system. Okay. And there, you can look at that in a very structured, deliberate, intentional kind of way. And you can do things. I mean, there are skills, there are areas to focus on that if you focus on those skills and areas, you can create a healthier system over time. And so I think, one of the ways that leaders need to show up much more powerfully, and whether this is in the church, we're not only lacking this in the church, we're lacking this in our society and in our culture. You don't see it in politics very often. You don't see it in business all that often, so on and so forth. But how do we create a healthy system? Okay, there are ways to break that down, define it, go after it, pursue it, and I think we ought to be doing more of that.
Yeah, just jumping on, because one important strategy that I think is really hampering our church's responsiveness to this crisis is so Intel in Patrick Lencioni's book, The Advantage, he talks about this principle that they practice at Intel: disagree and commit. I love that.
Say it again. What was that?
Disagree and commit.
Okay.
So in the interest of promoting all sides of an issue being considered, in the dialogue on an issue is like everybody's got to speak up and share their opinion on what a course of action might be, whatever the course of action is. And inevitably, there's a scenario where a majority emerges and, okay, it looks like things are headed in one direction, but not everybody in the room is headed in the same direction. So it's incumbent upon that person who disagrees to voice that disagreement. All right. A healthy system, though, is going to surface that disagreement. But then once the decision is made, that person is going to commit to the majority view and move forward. And that's the idea of commit. Share your view, but then move forward. The capacity of the system to navigate that difference and then move beyond it in unity is, I think, indicative of health. And that's what's critical. That's what's not happening is we have elders who are like, well, that wasn't my opinion. That's not what I thought. And then we end up circularizing our churches rather than that anxiety sort of being localized to the session and the session itself being an anxiety absorber. We're going to assume the responsibility of that burden and then move forward together and lead the church. So that principle of disagree and commit. Now, what's critical for sessions to do that is, one, the overall emotional intelligence and differentiation of each of those members has to be growing. So it has to be increasing. Two, there has to be growing trust. Like, we can still be connected even though we disagree on that issue. That's what we're losing in our society. Is if you don't agree with me, you're not my friend anymore. We're not on the same team anymore. And church needs to be a place where we can disagree and remain connected. It seems to me if we're thinking in terms of the gospel and the narrative of grace. So I just think this is what's essential to be happening in our churches that's not happening.
I think along that level, Bob Burns asked a question here. This gets to what we were talking about earlier regarding those cultural conversations. But how in what ways or in places can we instill that kind of mindset in our church? And certainly in the session, we have that conversation. This is what we need to do. Mm-hmm. But there's always usually something beneath the surface. So what thoughts do you have? Where are these conversations? Where can they or maybe should they take place?
Yeah. I mean, I think these themes could easily be put into a Sunday school class. Like here at Redeemer, we have a spiritual formation class that weaves together an emphasis on gospel dynamics and grace in the Christian life, as well as emotional intelligence and sort of social interaction, basically being a good church member. And what is that, how do we weave those themes together and, in a sense, lay the groundwork for how people are going to navigate what they experience downstream in the life of the church. So I think that's an important way. And then a way that can be reinforced. And I love what George was describing, these meetings, but our elders as shepherds being present, again, not solving, not being directive, but present in community groups, being just being there, checking in with community group leaders, asking people in the congregation, what are your questions? And those can be informal learning sessions that actually are lowering the anxiety in the church, because the elders are accessible.
Yeah, I just a serendipity here, but earlier today I was looking through some material and thinking about having this meeting that we're having right now, and I ran across a document that was produced. I can't remember how long. Maybe this was a good 6 or 8 months. It was somewhat pre-COVID to a certain extent, but we were thinking about these issues, and this hasn't been operationalized yet, but it's an example of in a disciplined fashion going after an issue and figuring out ways to, what is it that we want to teach and how are we going to deliver this. And so we gave it a name at that point in time. We called it the Considerations Program, and there was a problem statement. Why are we building this program? And so the problem statement is that we have passionate but unproductive discussions among Christians and unbelievers in the broader culture. Okay, and the purpose of the program would be to enable meaningful discussions that bring all concerned into a closer relationship with God and His purposes for our culture. And then we even went so far as to define the 3 parts of the program. So number 1, considering our hearts and what the Bible has to say about conflict. What does the Bible teach us about conflict and how to handle it productively? Number 2, learning how to engage in discussions in ways that honor God and His Word and His purposes for this world. There's lots of information and content out there about how to have tough discussions well and to do it in a healthy kind of a way. And then number 3 was, how are we going to apply these principles in discussions of controversial issues with other believers and non-believers? So again, it's an example of an idea that has some flesh built around it and a little bit of structure built around it in the early stages that you could move forward with. And that would have huge implications. And it's critical for, I think, pastoral staff, ruling elders, deacons, staff members in the church to demonstrate these kinds of skills in the day-to-day interactions with people. They can be taught, they can be built if we focus on them and make them important. And the way I think about it is it's the oil that's going to make the engine run a lot smoother. No matter what kind of engine we built, this is the oil that's going to run through that system. And if it isn't there, the system's going to burn out and shut down over a period of time. I have to come up with a new metaphor now that we're moving more to electronic vehicles, but it takes some time on that.
It's the electricity that recharges the battery.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, good. Are there any aspects in this issue that's unique to teaching elders and ruling elders? In that, do you see any issues, and I'm not thinking of anything in particular, in which the teaching elder and the ruling elder are talking past each other? I mean, one thing that always struck me was, as a pastor, I had all week to think about this topic. And it's not that my ruling elders were not engaged, but they were thinking about other things. And so this somewhat goes, Tom, to what you were saying. I came in already with stuff decided at times and thinking, why aren't you following me on this? I must not be a good leader because I've told you what I've been thinking about. So in facing these issues, what are some things that can help both the teaching elder and the ruling elder to function more effectively together in this work?
So I've had that exact conversation that you just described. I mean, literally word for word with myself. So, and as pastors, we sort of see things one way, and we are like, well, of course, this is what we need to do, and we need to do it yesterday. And so we don't even come with the right priority, but we have a pace that we've attached to that agenda item. And we tend to be, we feel late. And so we experience 2 different kinds of opposition from our ruling elders. One is they may not agree with the priority we're giving the issue, and they want to go much slower, which both can be frustrating for us because we're like, wait a minute, this is the way we need to do. So what I came to realize in my learning process, which I continue to learn, is the more significant an issue and the greater the likelihood that there will be disagreement, I need to slow the process down. I need to adjust my timeline. So if I'm feeling like we need to go fast, we need to go slower to expand the possibility for there to be meaningful dialogue. The other thing is I need to become the biggest advocate for the diversity of views. Whereas before I might have been like dismissive of minority opinions on an issue because I didn't want us to seriously consider it. I just wanted us to get to the right answer. I've now become the one who wants to get those minority opinions out there. And in fact, in our system, I mean, people kind of tease me about this now, but if you haven't spoken up on an issue, I will, okay, you need to speak up. What are you not telling us? Because oftentimes that individual has an insight. It may not change the overall direction, but it will enhance what we're choosing to do. But they're holding back. They're not speaking up. And so getting that information out there, I think, is the responsibility of the leader. And I think this goes back to a different aspect of the learning process of the leader. Is the younger in our leadership skill set, the more we think it's about getting certain outcomes accomplished. And the older we get and mature in leadership, the more we realize it's about the stewardship of the process through which outcomes are achieved. And I think that's a really important distinction, because it's less about what you actually do, or terms of, what's the specific outcome, and more about how did we get there? What kind of, again, going back to George's comment, what kind of system did we create to realize those goals? That's such a crucial part of being the leader. So.
Yep.
So I'm a young leader. Well, this is all theory, obviously, if you're looking at me. But I'm a young pastor and just getting started. I've got my own leaders are older than I am, more experienced. What are some things I should be thinking about and doing moving forward that will help in the future? Because we're going to come through this and there'll be another issue. But right now, I think we're highlighting some of the things because of the times in which we're living. What are some aspects there that would be helpful for that young leader? Think of like a church planter, that he might want to instill.
So clarify the question a little bit. So what would you want to tell the young leader about what?
Yes, as a young leader, starting off with the church, first session, or just stepping into a new session as a young leader. Again, some of what Tom was saying, slow down, let the whole disagree and commit. Someone is not talking, we want to hear it, but we walk out of the room when we're committed. Are there aspects that would help that person think more about process than product?
Yeah.
And again, so that's the concept. So is there something specific that will help process be understood is important? The product is important, but we're not going to have a healthy product if we don't have a healthy process.
Yeah.
Anything in particular? Well, if you have something, if not, there's something I have in my mind, but go ahead.
Well, I think one of the things that in my future role at Covenant Seminary, I think there used to be this idea that we were going to go to seminary when we were in our 20s, and then we were going to go be pastors for the rest of our life, and just, the gas tank is full and we're good. I increasingly know that paradigm is not workable, is not valid. That we have to be engaging in continuous learning throughout our lifetime in ministry. And we also need trusted mentors and partners to flourish. And so when I think about what does a young leader need, they need multiple aspects of strategies to be sustained in ministry. One is they need maybe a mentor, a coach, particularly as it pertains to navigating leadership challenges. Two, they need strategic continuous learning opportunities. So that can be a doctoral ministry program. That could be just taking classes at the local seminary. That could be offerings of our denomination. But there needs to be intentional engagement with those learning opportunities. And then there needs to be trusted peer relationships where I'm not being coached, but I am being myself. And I'm not accountable to my system in one sense. And I think those are some things that come to mind. I also would just highlight that RBI has engaged in a wellness project to come alongside pastors who are in need. And I know my buddy Ed Dunnington is going to be real glad that I'm mentioning this. But this wellness project is wanting to provide counseling resources to ministers and their wives as they engage these challenges. So that's another thing. There might need to be a time for focused counseling.
And now what you're describing, Tom, it sounds like something that might be happening at the seminary you might be aware of. Tell us about that.
So I'm excited. George and I are preparing to launch a doctoral ministry cohort, a Doctor of Ministry cohort in leadership and ministry, and that will begin in January of 2022. And it'll go over the course of 3 years. And if there's anybody watching today that's interested in that, I think you're going to provide the link for more information.
The link's in the chat box, and I'll send it out later as well.
Okay. But George and I would love to interact with you about that opportunity, because it's going to be bringing all of these things we're talking about to the fore. And then it will be the great thing about the cohort is it's a collaborative environment. So it's not just a vertical teaching relationship, but it's horizontal. And the learning happens in that horizontal context as much as anywhere else. So, George, do you want to add anything to that?
Specifically about the program?
Yeah.
So we've run this program once before, okay, and that was how many years ago, Tom?
We started in 2011.
Yeah. And so we started that program and ran it once before in 2011, and I was one of the people facilitating that program at the time, and Tom was in the program as a member of the program. All I can tell you is that I've never had a better professional experience in my life. Okay? It was so rewarding on so many levels. Okay. I got to know a great bunch of guys, mostly guys. We had one woman in the program. And they got to know each other better. They developed some really meaningful friendships that I think have continued and benefited them over the years since that. I think they were exposed to some real good models and tools that had a lot of practical impact on how they led, not only in their churches, but in some cases in their marriages and their families, with siblings, so on and so forth. It was really like, I've never had so much fun being a part of something that made a difference for the people, all of the people involved, whether you were facilitating it or a part of the program. And I'm just really looking forward to having an opportunity to do it again. make new friends, build new relationships.
And Chris, one more thought. What is so, I think, important about the leadership emphases that I think George and I would want to bring to the cohort is that there are skills, there are capacities, there is a body of literature out there that needs to be interacted with. But leadership is not technical in the way that we commonly think about like solutions. Like, oh, I just need to learn the formula and then boom, I'm good to go. Like, leadership questions and answers don't work that way. So it's inevitable. There is this dialogical and collaborative engagement that's so essential to navigating leadership challenges well. And that's what's so important about the cohort, is it gives you a model for doing the things that actually you're going to need to go back and do with your session and with your key constituents and your staff. And so we begin to model that behavior, because when you start the cohort, and George will remember this, not everybody's in the same place. And I remember some of our early cohort meetings thinking, wow, how is this group going to work together? But that was part of the learning process. And that is often what we experience in our sessions.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. There's, trying to watch our time here, but the one thing, let me just real quick, if you can each give one thing, if you had a piece of advice, do not do this or do this in 2021 as a leader.
You prep me for that one, Chris.
Here's the first thing that pops into my mind, and it references back to your question of a little while ago, which is, what would you tell a new young leader coming into a new organization? Mm-hmm. Well, here's the first thing that popped into my mind. Your first tendency coming in as a leader in an organization is to say, how do I make a difference? How do I make an impact? How do I score a touchdown? How do I, make some early wins, so on and so forth? What are my duties? What are my responsibilities? Mm-hmm. All those things are important to know. And I'm not throwing them out the window. But more important than that is that you need to stop, okay? And one of the most powerful things you can do early on is to diagnose or assess both who you are as an individual and who the system is. So stop, listen, look inward to yourself, diagnose the assets that you have and the liabilities that you have as a young emerging kind of a leader. And then get to know the people in your system and the system itself. How is it working currently? What's working well? What's not working well? What are the challenges you're facing? What are the opportunities you're facing? That takes time. You have to slow down a little bit, that tendency to move forward and make the early scores. But it's really, really, really important work, And I can't think of a better place to start than that.
I think what I would say is, if you don't have a mentor coach, if there's not someone that you're interacting with to help you navigate the challenges of leadership, if you don't have a sounding board, find that person, find that process. We cannot be successful in doing the task of leadership by ourselves. Just can't be a lone ranger.
Yeah. I think, as I've mentioned many times, since it's part of the whole Next Gen structure, is that pastoral health is always lived in community, and we are not healthy if we're not engaging with others through a struggle. And that's also understanding the allies and confidants issues that you'll see in resilient ministry, and figuring out how to move forward on that path. Well, thank you very much, Tom and George. In a couple of weeks, May 12th will be our next time. It really, in some ways, will pick up on this conversation. We talk about raising the next generation of leaders for both planting and renewal in the context of ministry. I've been doing these webinars for a year now, and I have not really talked a whole lot about Next Gen, which is part of my life as well as M&A. And so we'll be having on joining us Thurman Williams, who's there in St. Louis, as well as Dan Anderson down in Little Rock, and talking about the cohorts that they are mentoring, those who are preparing for ministry, and what the benefits of learning the soft skills. As I often say, hard skills will get you hired, soft skills will get you fired. And it's true in ministry as in so much of life.
That's right.
So thank you for joining us, and we appreciate this time together. Lord willing, see you next time. Bye.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.